I have with me Brock Beard, the founder and head writer of LastCar.info, a NASCAR website, the operator of his YouTube channel, and the author of JD, The Life and Death of a Forgotten NASCAR Legend. Brock, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Perhaps you could talk about your book for a moment, if you'd like.
Certainly. So, as you mentioned, I'm the author of this book right here, JD, The Life and Death of a Forgotten NASCAR Legend. It's published through Waldorf Publishing, available in these paperbacks as well. People can order it from myself over at lastcar.info. I got further details on the website, or through Waldorf Publishing themselves, as well as Amazon and some other sources as well. And what it is a story about J.D. McDuffie, who, as some people know, is the driver with the most NASCAR Cup Series starts without a single win. And he also had the most last place finishes from 1980 until 2014. Tragically, his life ended on August 11th, 1991, in a two-car accident at Watkins Glen International during the opening laps of the Budweiser at the Glen. His is a story that doesn't get talked about too much because he never won a race and because he also worked on his own cars and had a very small operation based out of Sanford, North Carolina. And there have been bits and pieces I'd heard about JD from a number of other sources. And we were originally thinking about doing an article for the 25th anniversary of the accident back in 2016. And it soon reached a point that we were getting so many interviews and so much information that we decided to go ahead and make it into a book. And that's how the book kind of came out.
Oh, that's very interesting to hear. It's very Now he certainly was a pretty good driver. I mean, like you said, he was an independent driver in a time where if they where you had a lot of where the top teams were basically Petty, Wood Brothers, Junior Johnson, and others, but he was able to compete with them in some cases. Like I believe there was a race at Dover in 1978 I believe where he qualified on the pole position and actually led a fair amount of laps, and he ultimately didn't win. I forget the exact circumstances, but am I correct here? I don't want what.
No, you are correct, and that is a big moment in JD's career. Is that pole win at Dover in 1978? As you said, yes, he did lead a number of laps in the 70 car that day, and it took quite a few people by surprise, including JD himself. I know in an interview with Richard Petty, when we talked to him at the Sonoma Raceway for this project, he was saying that JD didn't know what to do with himself when he won, and so there were thankfully some people that helped him out there. And yes, unfortunately, the engine let go on the car in the early stages. I believe he finished 33rd that day. But again, a big moment in his career, and you raise a good point there. I mean that again, that's another thing that's kind of been forgotten about JD is that he had a number of really surprising and strong runs throughout his career, and some tracks that he was actually quite good at. I think sometimes things like his lack of wins or not the last place finish statistic, for example, kind of overshadow a lot of those. And that's something that really the book is focusing on, too. It is primarily a biography, and it's also a complete account of his final race at Watkins Glen. But sprinkled in between, you'll get moments. We do talk a lot about the pole at Dover. We also talk about the fact that he qualified for the first Busch Clash in 1979 as a result of that pole, and also some strong runs that he had at Nashville and some other tracks on the circuit as well. And on top of that, the thing that I thought was most interesting in coming up with this book is hearing a lot of the information about his career before NASCAR when he was a really dominant dirt track driver. And of course, we just had Eldora a couple weeks ago. Really gives flashbacks to a time where there was a significant part of the schedule that were run on tracks like that, and JD was outstanding on those. So we pay homage to that part of his career as well.
He certainly was a good person. Either way, congratulations on the book, and I hope it does well. Now,
Oh, thank you.
you're welcome. Now, what got you into racing?
Well, I mean, racing, it's kind of been an interesting thing. I was thinking about that a lot and kind of putting this book together. I think two things that really drew me to the sport, and actually in 1991 was the first year that I followed the sport, I was very much interested in the certainly the competition, and also just the bravery of these individuals that participated in the sport. There's so many interesting stories behind the scenes, and a lot of them get reported, and you hear about people like Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon and Davey Allison, all these other big names over the years. But I was always interested in the ones that even slip by, kind of like the big names in the sport as well. And JD was kind of a figure that continually popped up when I was trying to do research on some of these smaller teams or lesser known drivers in the sport. And that really grabbed me like really early on in the sport. I remember going back into the Sonoma Raceway in 1994, and back then you had the Winston West regulars out there, and you would see cars at the track that you wouldn't really see on ESPN or TNN or anything like that on a week by week basis. And it made me wonder who those drivers were, and why they only ran a few races a year, and that was kind of the starting point there. So really, to answer your question, it was really those smaller stories in the sport that really pulled me into it right from the beginning, and it's a lot of my work in the sport has kind of been building on that over the years.
Well, you were talking about various smaller teams, lower budget teams, even just part-time teams. Some of them weren't necessarily that low budget, but a lot of them, whether it was NASCAR, IndyCar, or other racing series, they were able to gradually build themselves up to become full time, or even just become at least competitive when they did it. I mean, like the point that I'm trying to make though is that these days I would say in a lot of racing series it's just too expensive to at least do it part time. I mean, with the way payouts are structured, with NASCAR having their charter system or IndyCar having the leader circle program, um, it, and also kind of the attitude. Like, I don't know if you remember, like back in May, there was this thing where that Rob Kaufman was going on about how some of these part time teams, they were just so bad for NASCAR. Do you remember that?
I do. I was very surprised by his comments. This was. I know I responded to them as well there, and when he came out, I think that the concern that I had was the same concern I had when the charter system was first introduced, and that is, what threat do these small or underfunded teams pose to the big names? And I think that was something that he expressed, and it just sounded like it was entirely backwards. I think if you have these small teams out there to fill fields and bring more purse money in, that helps everybody out. And when you have shorter fields and this artificial pay structure in there, maybe that'll work for a little while there, but it's not a long-standing solution to any situations where you can't bring enough cars into the field. I think that was something that motivated the charter system from the beginning, is that these larger teams like the Hendricks and the Gibbs and the Roush teams and so forth felt that they couldn't attract sponsors unless there was some kind of intrinsic value, like an insurance policy, to make sure their team could still stay in operations. And maybe but I'm not a business expert, but I'm kind of thinking about, like, okay, who's really pulling the strings here? The team is what's offering the opportunity for these companies to market their products. They are the ones who should be sought out by the companies. And I think it's entirely backwards to switch it around like that. And that was really the concern I had with Rob. Is I think that he's created this system that is stagnated the garage area to a degree, and it hasn't actually accomplished what it set out to do, which is to preserve the 36 charter teams that were awarded initially. Certainly, we see with H. Scott Motorsports has closed its doors, and we've seen the trouble that BK Racing is now facing, and the situations they've had. They've already scaled back from 2 cars back to 1, and now everything that they're dealing with. It seemed to me that he was kind of celebrating a victory there, where I think that was a little bit short-sighted. So maybe a story like JD's is something that can kind of show people that in NASCAR, really the flavor of the garage area is when you take on all comers. With that, when you are Kyle Busch or a Jimmy Johnson, that you take on even local drivers that can get a car together and bring it into the sport. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the West Series guys coming out here to Sonoma. There was never any complaints about Dale Earnhardt or Ernie Irvan that they had to race against these guys. They were the best in their circuit as well, and that's really something that concerned me about what Kaufman was talking about.
Yeah, like basically at the time when I saw that on Twitter, I basically made the comment that the way I look at it is if the team and driver show up for a race, no matter who they are, and they're able to qualify for the race, they have as much right to compete as anybody else.
No, and that's exactly right. You have, I mean, for just because you're an underfunded team doesn't mean there's different rules for you. When you bring your car to the track, you still got to go through tech inspection. You still got to have a pit crew and get all your equipment together and everything, and that's not any different for anybody else. And they have to put as much money forward as possible to get their cars as fast as they want them to be. And if a good day for them is like finishing the race, or maybe finishing in the top 25 or something, then that's what they go for. And really, that was something that kind of controlled JD's career as well. One of the people I interviewed that talked about him, responded to people saying that, okay, well, JD was, he's not competing for a win every week. He mustn't be very good. It's like, well, at a certain time of his career, he realized that, look, we're looking to be the best of the group of drivers that we're competing against. And it was initially other independents, and then it was other underfunded drivers, and it was almost like class racing like you see in sports cars. And you had these races going on at the same time, and you still see that today. When you talk about Rick Ware's team or Starcom Racing and all that, you know that those two guys, maybe they don't have the resources to compete for a win on a weekly basis, but they certainly have the resources to compete against each other. And they're keeping an eye on that to track their progress. And that's what you see in the sport. And again, that's another thing that really interests me about the sport.
Sure. I mean, you look at the current driver and team champion in the Cup Series Furniture Row Racing. I mean, when they first showed up in NASCAR, they were not very competitive to say the least, but they gradually built themselves up. In the early 2010s, they started to be actually pretty quick on the super speedways, and then they started to win races when they had Truex. Well, actually, they started to be really competitive when they had Busch in the car. Then they started winning races when Truex joined them, and as we've seen, they've since become the champions. And so nothing to say that some other small team currently can't do that in the next 10 years or so. I mean, it's like anything, well, just one of those things where you have to see.
Exactly. No, and that's a very good point with Furniture Row. I believe I posted a tweet after they clinched the championship and said they went from being the last car champions in 2008 to the Cup Series champions in 2017. And you just see like how that, as you said, that transition, how they've been able to build those programs. And that's again goes back to what Kaufman was saying too. I mean, if you want in any capitalist system, you want to have as much competition as possible, because that makes the good guys even better, because they know they have to stay on their toes. They can't rest on their laurels. And some upstart team comes up there and they want a piece of the pie. They have the right to compete. But if you're the guy on top, you gotta keep fighting just as hard as you ever did to make sure that you stay ahead of them. And you see somebody like Furniture Row Racing that maybe nobody thought about back in 2008, and now suddenly they're one of the big three. They're one of the big three drivers that are dominating all these wins this year. And that's the problem I have with the charter system, is that now you have created a system where not only you've capped artificially the number of starters in the field to 40 drivers, you also say that there's 36 cars is now a full field, and to be one of those 36 guaranteed in all those starts, you have to buy a charter or lease it from somebody else on top of the cost of actually starting a program, which is already, as you said, is more expensive now than it's ever been. And you've created a situation now where it's so much more difficult now, on top of everything, to start a new team like that. And who is the next Furniture Row, team that's out there? I mean, maybe it is somebody like Starcom or Rick Ware, and we see them a decade from now being the championship contenders. It could certainly happen, and I certainly hope that it does. But I think for them, it's so much more difficult than it was for Furniture Row 10 years ago.
Yeah, pretty much in complete agreement with what you just said there. Now, moving on to another topic. Of all the drivers you've had interactions with, who has been the best and, if you're willing to answer, worst?
The best and the worst. Well, I mean, I do get asked this a lot because I mean certainly with the angle of my website, the last place finishers thing, it's sometimes it provides it's a great icebreaker. Sometimes it isn't, and I try to make it clear when there's a little bit of friction that our intent with the website isn't to like make fun of these drivers or belittle them or anything like that. The last place thing is really a framework that allows us to talk about these drivers that don't get featured that often and look at the back of the field and how last place exchanges. It's usually between a lot of these smaller teams. Even at Pocono last week, where we had 13 teams fall to the back of the field, you still have a scenario where you get to talk about the Rick Wares and the Starcoms. I'm mentioning them a lot just because they've come up a lot this year. They're certainly not the only ones in this category. But to answer your question, driver interviews. I'll mention a couple because I've mentioned them before. I interviewed Joe Nemechek, was I believe one of my first interviews when I was working at the Sonoma Raceway there, and even then, I mean, we had a very good interview, very civil. I have nothing against Joe at all, but I did sense when I went into the topic of like start and parking, that was a subject that he wasn't very comfortable with, and this was back in 2010 where a lot of these teams, that was back when NASCAR instituted their rule about like stripping down the last place car and basically adding a lot more money onto their bottom line, a lot more costs to their bottom line that they had than initially, and so that was probably a reason he was uncomfortable with it. I know I mentioned Joe also because some of his fans came out after one of my features and wondered why they thought my website was like a satire site or something like that, and I tried to make clear that that wasn't the intent at all. But I mean, again, it's hard to kind of pick one out because I've had a lot of very positive interviews, especially this year. We talked with I think one of our biggest supporters actually was Tommy Dreesy, who runs the road courses there. I ran into him when he was driving the Hercules car at Sonoma a few years ago, and he remembered me this year when he came back in the circuit here. So again, and he understood, that he was running towards the back of the field in 2014, and with the smaller team then, and the same thing now. But that we're giving them exposure, that we're doing our best to kind of talk about teams that don't get talked about that much. And we had some good interviews with him as well as with his team owner Derek Cope, who incidentally was the first driver I was a fan of back when I was a kid. So that was a nice touch there. Again, a lot of very positive interviews. Actually, I was remarking to the staff at the Sonoma Raceway earlier this year, and this was true that there were some drivers that are actually thanking me for interviewing them. And I don't want to sound conceited or anything about that, but this happened when I talked with like Chris Cook and some of these other drivers, and I think that a lot of these drivers for these small teams and a lot of these small team owners, they know that in this social media world and in the internet, it's very easy for stories to just get buried, and it's something to happen, it just doesn't get talked about. So when somebody comes out there and they actually want to talk to them and actually get their story out there, they're like, okay, great, I want to get more exposure for what I'm doing, and somebody knows that I'm here, and that really meant a lot to me because that showed me that there is importance in what we're doing, and that it's not just satire or anything like that. We're actually providing a service to bring up stories and offer a different look at racing, and perhaps also at athletics in general, to give a more complete picture of what happens each week.
Yeah, like I'll go and kind of continuing what you said there. I haven't really had any bad interactions with people in racing, or at least people like drivers, owners, team personnel, and whatnot. Like I'll admit I follow probably IndyCar a bit more than NASCAR, and so a lot of my interactions have been more with people from IndyCar, and I mean like I said, most of them have been pleasant, and also I started doing this like type of video back in just December of last year, and I mean like I've gotten various people to show up there, and all of them have been good. I would definitely say there's not been any hostility. Not that I feel like I've really asked anybody anything that would be considered that should make them angry.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
That's good to know. That's good to know. I mean, well, it's a difficult thing that we do with talking with these drivers sometimes, I know from your experience as well. You could attest to this. It's the same in IndyCar as well as in stock car racing. You sometimes run into these drivers and these team owners when they're under a lot of pressure and they're trying to get these cars ready, or maybe they haven't had the best day and they're just looking to move on. And this was sometimes that happens, but I mean that's from a media standpoint, you can't really you can't be too deterred by that. You just go out there and you do. You get whatever information you can, and you try to present it as best as you can for your audience, and I know I admire that you're doing IndyCar because it's really tricky. I tried it a couple of times at the Sonoma Raceway. I'm looking to do it again this year. I haven't heard back on that yet, but I know the driver. It seems like the media access to the drivers is a little bit trickier in some cases. I know it's hard to get down on pit road, at least at the Sonoma Raceway. So there's certainly those logistical challenges to kind of deal with as well versus NASCAR. But it's that's what makes the job interesting.
Yeah, it is. Well, you were talking about people who maybe they didn't have the best day, or they may have been under some stress. Yeah, like I know when I went to the Indianapolis 500 this year, as I have since 2004, after the race was going through the garage area, and saw that Takuma Sato, who had been at the time the defending Indianapolis 500 winner, who got taken out in a crash very very early on. He was at his garage signing autographs. Basically, like this was hours after it happened, and I was pretty surprised to see that. And I wouldn't have blamed him if he said, I'd maybe go back to the hauler or whatever.
Yeah, that's and that can happen too. I mean, it is interesting, what you see from like how different drivers handle that kind of thing. You know, back at the Sonoma Raceway earlier this year, the screenshot that shows at the top of my Twitter banner, I was out there trying to get an interview with Jamie McMurray because I wasn't sure if he had finished last at the time because he and AJ Allmendinger fell out in the same lap. So I was kind of juggling to see which interview I could get with both of them there. And I was trying to also stay out of the shot because Fox Sports had their camera right in front of me, and I didn't want to get in the way of their shot or anything like that. So I was getting out of the way of that, and then myself and Claire B. Lang, and I believe Jamie Little was the Fox Sports interviewer and stuff. We were doing the different interviews, and by the time Claire and Jamie were done with it, I was about to go in there, and McMurray was like, "Okay, no, that's enough," and I'm like, "Okay." So I'm like, at that point, I didn't push the issue. I was like, "Okay, look." And that again goes back to like what you were saying with Sato. I mean, there's that on the one end where maybe you have some drivers where okay they don't mind hanging out there afterwards, and then at the other end you have other drivers where they just want to just be done with it and they don't want to think about it, and that's they're done talking about it. So it's and again that's not a negative experience. I mean it just is what it is, and certainly it's when you're competing on a high level there, and then you're interviewing with these different people. Sometimes you're like, okay, I'm kind of done dealing with this. I'm going to kind of focus on just getting my flight back home, and I can totally understand that.
Yeah. Now, on to another question. There have been increasing rumors of street circuits becoming a part of NASCAR. What do you think about this?
Well, it would certainly be interesting. I mean, I watch a little bit of IndyCar there, and you watch like Long Beach, and I know you've seen like the Pinty series, and they have some street courses they're running too. So it kind of makes you think about that and what it would be like, on that. I think it would be really great. I mean, I think it'd be quite something to watch because you watch all these promos that they do for like the awards banquet, and then they bring like all the guys down to the Las Vegas Strip and just drive the cars down there and do donuts. And you start thinking, it's like, yeah, this could work. This would be something else. I've always been a big fan of road course racing in general. Again, I've been going to the Sonoma Raceway basically every year since 1992. And anytime they go left and right, if it's on a purpose-built road course or a street course, I think that'd be fun to watch, and it'd be very easy to market. And kind of stay ahead of Formula E and these other circuits that are doing the same thing, and kind of show like, look, our cars can do this too, and it really opens up like how many different places you could actually run a race on, even if they can't build a track per se. Put some road barriers out there, and then see what happens. I mean, if we're going to do a roval here at the Charlotte Motor Speedway this fall, I certainly think we can at least give it a try. I think it would be something to watch.
Per- Personally, I do think there will be probably you probably will see some of these C Street circuits join the one at least one of the three main series in the next few years. I mean, I don't know when the next schedule like when they do the schedules again, like because like like I think it could be something where say go you first see it in the Truck Series or Xfinity Series to kind of test to see how it is. Now, and I think there's both positives and negatives to it. I think on one end you're essentially bringing the race to the people, and potentially they become fans and they start to follow it more. But I would also say, and you kind of see this with IndyCar somewhat, that that some of these races they're basically dependent on who's on basically local politics. I mean, say the mayor or city council who just really wants that race so badly, all of a sudden there you got a different mayor or a different city council, and they say, "Why do we have this?" and it just disappears.
No, it's very true. It's very true. And actually, that kind of goes it kind of goes back to my book a little bit too, because if you really think about it, the racing in Watkins Glen International started on just running on the roads initially. That they just had a purpose built. The Cameron Argetsinger after World War II kind of worked out a route right around his hometown, and set that up, and that was the original road course that it was literally a road course. You would just drive on these purpose built roads, and street course is a little bit of a different thing. I mean, we're talking about like intersections maybe in a major metropolitan area, but the concept's kind of the same. That you have to as you mentioned, you got to work with the city council, and in the case of the Arget Singers, they had to work with the local railroad because the existing course was bisected by, I believe it was the New York Central Railroad halfway through, and they had to make sure that the train stopped because on each lap the cars would be crossing the tracks, and of course you can't stop and look both ways if you're going as fast as they were going, and but they were able to work this out back in 1948. That's why they call it the day they stopped the trains. But this is something that hopefully these days we should be able to accomplish. And if it's in Long Beach or if it's in one of these other locations, Baltimore or anywhere else, it certainly I think it would be an interesting venue.
Yeah. Also, what change or changes to NASCAR over the years do you think have been for the better or for the worse?
Well, we talked a lot about the charter system in this, and that's certainly one I think that has been more of a change to the worse, unfortunately. And I've already elaborated on that, so I don't want to bore your listeners with more of that. But I do think that's certainly one thing that certainly could turn around. But in terms of things for the better, I've been kind of surprised by some kind of the pessimism about the quality of the racing this year, and the fact that okay, Dale Jr. retired, and Danica Patrick retired, and stepped out and all that, and okay, there's not enough star power, so to speak. I think one of the best things, maybe not that NASCAR has done, but something that NASCAR is doing is, or what NASCAR is now, is with a lot of these new kids that are in there. I mean, I remember at Pocono last June when you had Ryan Blaney winning the race, and you had Darrell Wallace making his first start, Bubba Wallace making his first start in the 43 car, and both of them are driving two of the most iconic paint jobs, and both of them celebrating together in victory lane like as good friends and everything. I saw that and I was like, you know what, whatever happens with the racing or everything, the sport is going to be fine. The sport is going to be fine without a Jeff Gordon or a Dale Jr. or something like out there. The next group of stars, are coming up the ranks, and even if we're not seeing as many teams go up the ranks as we were talking about earlier, I think we're still getting a really interesting group of guys, and we've seen this even just last week. I mean, thankfully, hopefully, Bubba's feeling better after that scary accident back at Pocono there. And but we also saw the better side of that. We saw Alex Bowman have a great run. We saw Daniel Suarez almost pull off the win. And it's only a matter of time until they close that gap. And I think that's been a really exciting thing to follow this year. It's almost like a clean slate. You have these guys out there that I think are really interesting personalities, and they're young, and they seem to have good fan followings of their own, and I think there's a lot of potential in the group there. It's just if we can get the sponsorship and the team angle worked out here to make sure that they have rides and they can show off their skills, and I think by having Blaney in a Penske car, and by having Bubba in the Petty car, and by having Bowman in the Hendrick car, and Suarez and Jones on Gibbs, that's a big step in the right direction. That you have these young kids and you have these quality rides, and they're making a statement, I think, and I think we are on the cusp of actually having a real changing in the guard. And I know it doesn't feel like it because we've had Kevin Harvick and Martin Truex and Kyle Busch seemingly every week. But if you look behind it, and again, this is kind of something I proposed on last car. If you look at the rest of the field, you start seeing these people start moving up the pack, and you start seeing things kind of change a little bit. And then pretty soon they're going to be the group here. And maybe this is just a year where the old guard is grabbing as many wins as they can, and then suddenly it just changes. And the sport has done that over and over again. And I think it's exciting because I think it's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, just because some of these younger drivers aren't necessarily winning week in, week out, I think a lot of them are still going to fill the shoes left by various drivers who have left the sport over the last few years. But I would also say,
Well,
but I would,
yeah, and you mentioned that. I mean, and that's kind of the metric that I think is interesting too, is that the fact of a rookie winning a race. It used to be not too long ago that was unheard of. Like it was remarkable when a rookie just ran well or just didn't crash every week. Like it wasn't until we really had certainly Davey Allison was the first to really kind of set that mark at least in recent years. But he was really the exception. It wasn't until 1999 with Stewart that suddenly he was winning like two or three races a year that we started thinking, oh, well, if you're a new driver, it's almost expected that you're going to be winning that first year. And we haven't seen that in every rookie group. And even in 1998, I remember, like right before Stewart's group, you had Kenny Irwin, you had Jerry Nadeau, you had Steve Park. These are drivers that, tragically Irwin's life was cut short, but Jerry Nadeau and Steve Park end up becoming winners, not in 1998, but then in the years ahead. And, you just never know what's going to happen with these groups. And so, it's kind of similar to the Kaufman thing there, where it's kind of interesting to hear people use that as the metric that they're not winning, but I think they are still succeeding in one measure or another.
right. I mean, you look at back in about the period of say 1993, 1994 time frame when you started to have people like Jeff Gordon and Bobby Labonte, also Jeff Burton, start showing up in NASCAR and had some success. I mean, Gordon in his second year, I mean, he won at Charlotte and Indianapolis, but Labonte and Burton wouldn't win until they joined admittedly larger teams. The point that I'm making is that it's kind of like it's really a parallel to the current era in the sense that you look at those 2 years, the dominant drivers were say Dale Earnhardt, Rusty Wallace, Ernie Irvan, and others, but those were, if for lack of a better term, really the big three of that time. And I mean, just because they were the dominant ones didn't necessarily make people think that some of these younger drivers who showed up in that time, who went on to have a lot of success, wouldn't be eventually successful.
No, that's a very good point. That is a good comparison, and it's interesting kind of looking at that '94 season in particular. You mentioned, I mean, just the depth of talent that year. That's when you got like you said, Jeff Burton and Joe Nemechek and Ward Burton, and you think about the careers that a lot of them had. I mean, you think of Jeff Burton when he was just dominant at Darlington all those times, and then you think of Ward winning the Southern 500, winning the Daytona 500. And you think about Joe Nemechek and his long career, as I mentioned. Even still racing today, just running the Truck Series just last week. You never know when that staying power, when that star power is going to be, and I think it's as long as you're patient with this group, and that you don't just say, oh well, they didn't win the first 21 races of the year, I guess they're bust. It's like, well, no, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, it could be 5 years. I mean, look at Joey Logano. I mean, if he didn't, that ride didn't open up at Penske, maybe we wouldn't be even seeing him up there winning this year. And he would have maybe just, the teammate at Gibbs didn't work out, and then maybe he would have gone back to the Xfinity Series and he just would have been there. But sometimes these opportunities open up, and that's where you really see some of these drivers really succeed. And maybe that's the case with some of the guys we're seeing now, even that maybe aren't necessarily on a top ride, but they could be up there, and something opens up, and then suddenly they have another chance at it.
Yeah, sure.
Alex Holman is a perfect example of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think another good example would be Ryan Preece, who in 2015 he did a couple Cup Series races for Premium Motorsports, and admittedly he really didn't do a whole lot. But the past 2 years in the Xfinity Series, he's shown up in Gibbs's car, generally he is part-time, and I mean each year he's won a race, but he's also been very competitive in others. And I wonder if eventually when Bell gets put up into the Cup Series, if Preece would become Gibbs's main driver down there, and then next in line for the Cup Series whenever a Gibbs or at least Toyota car opens up. I wonder.
Mm-hmm. Well, that would be, and I've heard from some other people about Preece that one thing that a lot of people really enjoy about him is that he does it like the classic way. Like he's brought these sponsors on with him, and he's brought them up, and he's doing it the right way. They say, and it's not like he's like a ride buyer or whatever derogatory term people are throwing around with whatever. That he is a hard scrabble kid, and he races his heart out. And yes, like you said, he gave it a try even in the Cup Series and got some valuable laps there. And who knows? It could be that the success he's having now is really because of the ability he had to get that ride at Premium and just get his legs under him at Martinsville and some of those other tracks back late that season. So again, like I said before, you never know where the next talent's going to come from.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things, or just one of those things where you just wait and see. And now, I also have two Twitter users have some questions for you. 3 questions in all. Rob Taylor, at Drawn by Rob T, asks if you will be doing any card tricks at Watkins Glen.
Oh yeah, Rob Taylor is an outstanding individual. I've talked with him before. He's a motorsports artist based out of Niagara Falls, Ontario, and he actually did some artwork and stuff for me for years ago. We actually did a benefit for the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's a few years ago, and he donated some of his drawings for that. And he's got a very interesting story. You can look it up on my last car website. There, we did a feature on it back in 2013. But as for the card tricks, I'm afraid I'm not very coordinated when it comes to that. But I am going to be meeting up with him this week. We're going to be we're heading up to Watkins Glen, New York, for our book signing. That's going to be this Saturday at Smalley's Garage over in downtown Watkins Glen. But before that, we're going to go ahead and meet up with Rob at his place up in Ontario. Myself, my brother, that is. And we're going to go over there and check out his studio and meet up with him. And there's going to be more you're going to be hearing about Rob here in the next few days, too.
All right, then. Also, Joshua C. Pruitt, at May's Jacket, asks what the most common reason for a failure to finish is, and what are the reasons for a failure to finish that have not been listed in more than 10 years.
The statistical analysis on this is always one thing that's fun for me on there, and some of those are ones I hadn't thought of here. Let me get the page up here, and I'll get my spreadsheet out here, and I can answer that for him. Let's see. So if you're looking at the most common reason out, I believe that was the first he was asking there. Across all 3 series, a crash is just ahead of an engine failure. Those are far and away. Those are the big 2 if we're using the comparison to what we see nowadays. Through last weekend we've had 1,154 accidents across the top three series that have resulted in the last place finish, or rather, a driver being classified last. And an engine is behind it of 1,061. So the margin is pretty close, less than 100 finishes between the two of them there. And it said like ones that weren't common within the last 10 years. So I believe that was the other question.
Yes.
Let's see. I mean, just looking back here, let me sort this. I'm going to check the next page here for that. So I have seen some other ones. There's one, I'll give a filler statistic here in the meantime. One thing I noticed the other day, I like to look over my pages here from time to time. And one thing I did notice among car numbers was the car number 21 didn't have a single last place finish between 1970 and until 1980. Like the entire decade that David Pearson was driving for like the Wood brothers and also, well, other drivers as well. I believe A.J. Foyt's Daytona 500 win was in that span. Not a single last place finish. And I thought that was really interesting. It really speaks to how successful the Wood brothers were and are really today. And, especially during that decade. So I thought that was kind of interesting. There's certainly one that's a rarity across in last place finishes for that time period. But let me look at, let's check this one right here. We'll do my statistics by the type of finish, and I can at least look at the classification here for you. And let's take a look-see here. So let's see. I'm looking at, we haven't had a, let's see, in the Cup Series at least, I have this separated by division. I'll do the Cup Series ones for this reader here. We're looking at rocker arms, have not been a common cause for a last place finish in a while. The last one of those was Ricky Craven at Darlington in the spring of 1995 that I see on here. If you want to go back even further than that, the cause of finish, a rod, I guess, a rod thrown in the engine there, only has come up twice. That's since 1965. That would be Neil Castles back then. And this is again the great thing with this. I do some of these features, as the reader probably knows too, for my my last car stat of the week. So you'll probably preview of coming attractions on some of this. Let's see. Let me get some other ones here. A push rod that hasn't come up since the 1983 Daytona 500 with Benny Parsons. So there's another one. Or but then you look in comparison, you see ones that are much more common more recently. Bird Piston, 1996 at Michigan by Derek Cope. There's one there. I mean, those are just a few of them right there. But definitely stay tuned to the lastcar.info, and you'll hear more statistics like that.
That certainly is interesting to hear. Brock, I once again want to thank you for taking time out of your day to do this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. And like I say, for your readers out there, for your viewers out there, definitely check out my book right here. If you can go on to lastcar.info, I got some information where you can buy some of these copies from me personally, and I can sign them for you. Also have links to the Amazon page, and Waldorf Publishing looks like it's the best place to buy them online so far. That link is also on that page. I'll also be, as I mentioned, I'm going to be in Watkins Glen, New York this weekend. I'm going to be at a book signing this Saturday at Smalley's Garage with both Linda McDuffie, who is JD's daughter, and Charlie Birch, who is a photographer who was actually at the track in Turn 5 on the morning of August 11th, 1991. So if you want to come by and have us, check out the book and talk to the three of us, that would be a good time for it. And we'll also be attending the race this weekend. I want to wish good luck to Spencer Gallagher, who he and I have gone to the same internet forum for years, and I just heard that he's going to be making his Cup debut for BK Racing this weekend, and apparent coordination with GMS Racing. So best of luck to him this weekend, and should be a good race. And we'll also spread the word about JD this weekend, and it's going to be very exciting, very interesting.
Well, thank you.